In the warm stillness of 1880s Alabama, where the scent of magnolias drifted through the summer air, a small house stood quiet. Too quiet. Inside, a child named Helen Keller sat in a corner, her tiny hands waving through the air, searching for a world she could no longer feel. Illness had taken her sight and hearing before she was 2 years old, sealing her in a prison of silence and darkness. Her parents watched helplessly as their daughter slipped further away. They tried to speak to her, but their words were swallowed by the void. She could not hear their voices nor see their tears. Frustration became her only language. She screamed, kicked, and broke things she could not name, fighting shadows only she could sense. The once peaceful Keller home became a battlefield. Hope was fading, replaced by exhaustion and fear. The little girl was alive yet lost, her world reduced to confusion and rage, but destiny was waiting beyond that despair. One spring morning, a young woman arrived at the Keller doorstep, her eyes sharp, her posture firm, her spirit unbroken. Her name was Anne Sullivan. She too had known blindness and suffering. Yet within her burned an unyielding fire, a belief that even the darkest silence could be broken. As Anne reached out and took Helen's small hand, two worlds collided, the teacher who had clawed her way out of darkness and the child still trapped within it. No one could yet know that this moment, in a quiet southern yard, would mark the beginning of one of humanity's greatest miracles. The awakening of a soul that could neither see nor hear, but would one day teach the world how to feel. From the moment Anne Sullivan stepped into the Keller home, the battle began, not against blindness or deafness, but against despair itself. The walls of the house had long echoed with Helen's screams, her hands flailing, her mind trapped in chaos. Anne saw not a wild child, but a soul desperate to communicate, a spark buried deep under years of confusion. Her methods were unlike anything the Kellers had seen. She refused pity, she refused fear, she demanded discipline. To the shocked family, she seemed harsh, too strict for a fragile child. But Anne knew that kindness without structure was only another kind of prison. She believed that before Helen could learn, she had to trust. And before she could trust, she had to understand that there were rules in this silent world. Each day became a test of wills. At the dining table, Helen would thrash and throw food, unaccustomed to control. Anne stood her ground, patient but unyielding, teaching Helen that every gesture had meaning, that her hands could shape words. The struggle stretched on for hours, days, weeks. The Keller home became both a classroom and a battlefield, filled with tears, anger, and exhaustion. Finally, Anne made a bold decision. She convinced Helen's parents to let her take the girl away from the comfort and chaos that clouded her mind. Together, teacher and student retreated to a small cottage near the main house, where silence could finally have purpose. There, the lessons grew harder. Helen resisted everything, slapping away Anne's hands, tearing apart her work, screaming in frustration. Yet Anne never faltered. She spelled words into Helen's palm again and again: doll, cake, water, mother. Each letter a knock on the walls of darkness. And though Helen could not yet understand, something inside her had begun to stir. A faint awareness that these shapes, these patterns, meant something. It was the first flicker of light beneath the surface. The world saw only tantrums and struggle, but Anne saw what no one else could: the slow birth of language within silence. The war was far from over, but for the first time, hope had entered the battlefield. The morning was warm and still, the kind of southern dawn where the air hangs thick with expectation. For weeks, Anne Sullivan had fought what seemed an unwinnable war. Every word she spelled into Helen's hand fell into emptiness. Every lesson ended in tears. The world still made no sense to the child lost in darkness. But that morning, something shifted. Anne led Helen outside to the old water pump in the yard. The sun broke through the trees, catching the iron handle as Anne grasped it and began to pump. Cool water burst forth, splashing against Helen's hands, wild, cold, alive. In that moment, Anne took Helen's small hand and spelled into her palm, Water. Helen froze. She stood motionless, her fingers twitching, her lips parting in silent realization.
Again Anne spelled it.
Water again and again as the water poured over Helen's hands.
And then a spark.
The connection, the impossible bridge between the abstract shapes and the living world. Helen's face changed, confusion melting into wonder and wonder into joy. She touched the pump, the ground, Anne's dress, asking,
pleading for the names of everything around her. The world,
once silent and black, had found its first sound, not through ears or eyes, but through meaning. Anne wept. She had watched the child's soul awaken, the darkness breaking, the silence cracking open like dawn after endless night. That single moment at the water pump became more than a triumph of learning. It was the moment a human being re-entered the world. From that day forward, Helen became insatiable. Her hands never stopped moving. She touched everything, learning faster than Anne could teach. Each new word was a victory. Ground, tree, mother, teacher. She had been blind and deaf, but she could now see with her mind. Within weeks, Helen learned hundreds of words. Within months, she began to read Braille. Her hunger for understanding knew no limit. It was as if she had discovered the very key to existence itself. And through every lesson, Anne was there, her patient hands guiding Helen's, her spirit burning brighter than ever. For the first time,
Helen laughed, truly laughed, not from instinct, but from understanding.
She knew she was alive. She knew that she was Helen. And in that small Alabama yard, with nothing but an old pump and two determined souls, the world had witnessed a miracle, the birth of language from silence, of light from darkness. Years passed, and the child who once raged in silence now stood before the world as a beacon of intellect and courage. Helen Keller, once considered a hopeless case, had become a miracle in motion. With Anne Sullivan always by her side, she entered the halls of Radcliffe College, her fingers gliding swiftly across Braille pages, her lips shaping words the world thought she'd never speak. Every day was a battle, letters, lectures, endless translations between touch and thought. But Helen refused to yield. She became the first deaf-blind person in history to earn a college degree. And when she stepped across that stage, diploma in hand, the applause was not for victory over disability, but for the triumph of the human spirit itself. Her words began to travel farther than her touch ever could. She wrote books, gave speeches, and inspired millions. But behind every step forward was Anne, her teacher, her interpreter, her other half. The two were inseparable, Helen the vision, Anne the eyes.
Helen the voice, Anne the echo. Yet fame, as always, casts long shadows.
The world adored Helen, but few saw the toll it took on her mentor. Years of teaching, signing, guiding, the endless strain on Anne's own failing eyesight began to wear her down. Her hands, once firm and confident, began to tremble. The woman who had given Helen light was now slowly losing her own. As Helen's fame grew, the distance between them, emotional, not physical, began to widen. Helen met new people, new admirers, men and women who saw in her not a pupil, but a symbol. Anne, proud yet weary, often stood at the edges of those crowds, her smile steady but her heart heavy. There were moments when Helen could feel it, the silence between them shifting, not from deafness, but from time. She would reach for Anne's hand, still familiar, still warm, and trace the word that had begun it all. Water.
Anne would smile, her eyes glistening with unspoken memories. And then, one quiet evening, the inevitable came. Anne Sullivan, the miracle worker, the girl with the fire in her soul, slipped away, her life's flame gently fading into the dark.
For Helen, it was as if the world had gone blind once more. She was alone in the quiet she had once feared, facing it without the one who had taught her how to see. But grief did not break her. It transformed her. Helen carried Anne's light within her. The lessons, the courage, the voice that had taught her to find meaning in a world without sound. She continued her work tirelessly, fighting for the rights of the blind, the poor, the oppressed. Her speeches thundered with conviction. Her words, shaped by hands that once knew only chaos, now reached across continents. Even as she aged and her body weakened, Helen's spirit never dimmed. When people asked how she endured the loss, she would smile and say softly, "Love is something you feel with your soul, not your eyes." And so, though Anne was gone, her light burned on, in Helen, in her words, in every life touched by her message. The miracle at the water pump had not been a moment. It had been the beginning of a revolution, a proof that even in the darkest silence, the human spirit can still sing. In her later years, Helen Keller became more than a name. She became a movement. She traveled across continents, her fingers tracing new alphabets, her voice soft, deliberate, echoing through halls filled with presidents, poets, and paupers alike. In every country she visited, from Japan to Egypt, she carried not pity but purpose. She did not come to be seen. She came to remind humanity to see. Her message was simple yet profound, that blindness was not of the eyes but of the heart, that the truest form of deafness was not silence but indifference.
And that love, the one thing she had learned without ever hearing or seeing it, was the only language that needed no translation. Time,
ever patient, began to dim her physical strength, but her spirit remained luminous. When asked what she feared most, she would smile faintly and reply, "I have walked through darkness before. It no longer frightens me." Helen Keller passed away peacefully in 1968 at the age of 87. The world mourned, but it also stood in awe. A girl once locked in eternal night had become a torch that guided millions toward compassion,
understanding and faith in the unseen, and perhaps,
in her final moments, as the veil of this world fell away,
Helen truly saw why for the first time.
Not with eyes, but with the same radiant soul that had always reached beyond limitation. Her life remains a testament that the greatest miracles are not born from light, but from the courage to find it within darkness. For in the story of Helen Keller, we are reminded that to be human is not to see or hear. It is to feel, to connect, and to love without boundaries.